Good day and welcome to this press conference, which is being held by the Cape Independence Advocacy Group, or CIAG. My name is Leila van Duchler, and today I will be joined by CIAG spokesperson, Dr. Joan Swart, and co-founder Phil Craig. The purpose of this press conference is to announce the results of our latest poll on Cape Independence. The poll was conducted by Victory Research, and polling took place between the 12th and the 18th of March. It was a random telephone poll, and the sample was fully demographically representative of the Western Cape adult population. The sample was 820, and the margin for error is 3.5%. Joan, I'd like to come to you first, please. What was the purpose of this poll?
Thank you, Leila, and good morning to everybody. The purpose of the fourth poll, was to gauge current sentiment in the Western Cape amid significant changes that we saw recently. We wanted to understand how people feel about the multi-party charter's failure, the government of national unity struggle, and a shifting global environment. Additionally, we assessed the relatively poor performance of the Cape Independence parties in the 2024 elections and what that means for the movement in the future. Essentially, we're asking, where does Cape Independence stand today? This poll gives us a clear snapshot of public sentiment to gauge our next steps.
Cape Independence poll that the CIAG has conducted. And one of the things we've seen with previous polling is that people are reluctant to accept the validity of the polling data. Is this polling reliable?
Thanks again, Leila. Yes, as for reliability, yes, most definitely. This polling is valid, reliable, and it's also robust. So it was conducted by Victory Research, a leading firm that accurately predicted the 2024 election outcomes. It's built on a sample of more than 800 people that are fully representative of the Western Cape demographics. This aligns with international polling norms, with a tight margin of error as a key statistic. Combined with our previous polls, we've now surveyed 3,500 people, leaving no doubt about the support for Cape Independence and that it's widespread and robust. Some question the data because election results differ, but there's a key distinction. Elections are not referendums. Many Cape Independence supporters strategically vote DA, which our polling reflects. So in this poll, it is not guesswork, it's data calling it right.
Thank you, Joan. I'm now going to hand over to Phil Craig, who will present the main findings of this latest poll.
Thank you, Leila, and thank you, Joan, and hello to everybody. I'm just going to jump straight in with the results. So the first set of results I'm going to share relate to the environment in which this poll has taken place. We know that the ANC no longer has an outright hold on power and that we now have a government of national unity, which at the time that this poll was conducted was not in any trouble. And the first question we asked was whether people in the Western Cape thought that South Africa was going in the right or the wrong direction. 24% of respondents thought that South Africa was going in the right direction, and 68% thought it was going in the wrong direction, and 8% were undecided or chose not to say. And here it's significant to note that Kaapenaars were more positive about South Africa than there had been during any of the three previous polls, although 2/3 of respondents still felt that South Africa was going in the wrong direction. Then we followed this question up by asking Kaapenaars how well they thought the GNU was performing. Only 6% thought it was performing very well, but 52% thought it was performing quite well. 18% thought it was performing quite badly, 10% thought it was performing very badly, and 13% were undecided or chose not to say. So 2/3 of those who expressed an opinion thought the GNU was performing at least adequately. And this provided a very interesting context in which to establish people's current views on Cape independence, and then brings me on to the next section of our poll. We asked Carpenars whether or not they supported a referendum being held on Cape independence. 51% of respondents said yes, they did support a referendum being held. 44% said no, they didn't support a referendum being held, and 5% were undecided and chose not to say. And here we've created a graphic to illustrate this statistic. When it came to support for Cape independence itself, 43% of respondents said they supported Cape independence, 53% said they opposed Cape independence, and 5% were undecided or chose not to say. And again, we've created a graphic to illustrate this statistic. Finally, we asked Carpenars whether they believed Cape independence would improve the quality of their life. 50% said they believed it would, 40% said they believed it would not, and 9% were undecided or chose not to say. And again, we've created a graphic to illustrate this statistic. These results confirmed there is significant support for Cape independence, including that a majority of Carpenars favour holding a referendum to settle this issue once and for all. And this was despite the fact that the majority also thought that the GNU was at least performing adequately well, and that very few Western Cape voters had actively voted for Cape independence parties in 2024. However, support for Cape independence was notably lower than during the last poll in 2023. So in the next section of our poll, we've looked at the key political and demographic findings. And I'm going to begin by looking at who demographically supports Cape independence. And I'm going to use ethnicity and then language as the primary reference points. As was the case in 2023, support for Cape independence is highest among coloured respondents at 60%, then amongst white respondents at 47%, and lowest amongst black respondents at 16%. We then looked at support for Cape independence by language, and there had been a notable shift in opinion since 2023. Support for Cape independence at 63% was highest amongst Afrikaans speakers, the majority of whom, we must remember, are coloured. And support amongst English speakers, which in 2022 and 2023 was marginally higher than amongst Afrikaans speakers, was now at 43% and significantly lower than amongst Afrikaans speakers in this poll. Support amongst Xhosa speakers was at 19%. Then finally, we looked at support by political party. 72% of Cape independence supporters voted DA in 2024, and 11% voted for the Patriotic Alliance. And we've created a graphic to illustrate this statistic. And this repeated the pattern of all three previous polls, once again confirming that the overwhelming majority of Cape independence supporters are voting for the DA, and that there is no conflict between election results and our polling data. To the contrary, Cape independence supporters vote exactly as polling predicts they will. Now, this presents challenges to both supporters and opponents of Cape independence alike. At the CIAG, we've always asserted that you cannot measure support for Cape independence, which is a single issue question, in elections which are party political and where people vote across a range of issues. This is precisely why referendums and not elections are the accepted means to establish support for Cape independence. And in fact, this cuts both ways. For example, when the Scottish Nationalist Party won an outright majority in Scotland in 2011, it could not use that election result to declare Scotland independent. Instead, support for independence was established in the 2014 Scottish independence referendum. And exactly the same principle applies here in the Western Cape. Polling has consistently confirmed that the overwhelming majority of Cape independence supporters do not vote for Cape independence parties, but instead for the DA based upon their record of government. Now, this puts significant pressure on the Cape independence movement to find a viable mechanism by which to force the DA-led Western Cape government to listen to Western Cape voters on Cape independence, including most notably their own DA voters. And the inability thus far of Cape independence parties to challenge the DA electorally has unfortunately emboldened the DA to frustrate calls for a referendum. Now, in this poll, we once again specifically interrogated support for Cape independence amongst DA supporters in the Western Cape. 65% of DA supporters believed Cape independence would improve their quality of life. 59% favoured a referendum being held on Cape independence, and 50% favoured Cape independence itself, where 46% were opposed. And again, we've created a graphic to illustrate this statistic. A notable change in the 2025 poll is that it's taken place in an environment where the DA has come out strongly against Cape independence and has been asserting that the DA can save all of South Africa via the GNU. And fascinatingly, it appears that the DA has been able to convince a significant number of white English-speaking voters that it can, whilst Afrikaans-speaking voters of all races have been much less willing to believe the DA. Moving forward, the relationship between the success or failure of the GNU and support for Cape independence is a data point which we're monitoring very carefully. Our expectation is that should the GNU collapse, there will be a significant surge in support for Cape independence. The next section of the polling results look at the ideology behind support for Cape independence and the potential political alternatives. First, we asked about support for additional provincial autonomy and whether the Western Cape should be able to choose its own policies. 63% of respondents believed that it should. 34% of respondents believed that it should not, and 4% were undecided or chose not to say. Then we asked whether the Western Cape should have federal autonomy. 57% of respondents believed that it should, 39% believed that it should not, and 4% were undecided or chose not to say. And we've illustrated this strong desire for regional autonomy in a graphic. And finally, we asked whether respondents wanted cultural autonomy and the ability to self-govern within their own cultural group. 40% said they did, 54% said they did not, and 6% were undecided or chose not to say. And here, there was a very marked difference between English speakers, where only 22% favoured cultural self-government, and Afrikaans and the Xhosa speakers, both of whom were split 50-50 on this question. In the final question of our poll results, we looked at the geopolitical environment which has taken on greater significance following the US's recent and sustained criticisms of South Africa. Here we asked Kaapenaars directly whether they would prefer to be more closely aligned with the US and the EU or with China and Russia. 63% said that we should align ourselves most closely with the US and the EU. 26% said that we should align ourselves most closely with China and Russia, and 12% were undecided and opted not to say. And again, we've created a graphic to illustrate this statistic. And we'll certainly be bringing the statistic to the attention of the US government when our delegation arrives in Washington later this week. And that's the end of the polling results for 2025. I'm going to pass you now back to Leela.
Okay. You can find a copy of these results as presented by Phil on the CIAG website at www.capeindependence.org. The link is also in the description. There'll now be an opportunity for questions. We'll take the media first. Please introduce yourself, name and media outlet, and then we'll take questions from supporters and members of the public. Handing over to you, Joan.
Thank you, Leela. So I'm just waiting for a question to appear on screen, giving the audience a little bit of time to ask questions. So I've noticed some questions already. The one that intrigued me the most, of course, is who will be in charge of the Navy. Now, Janine, thank you for answering that partly. So, of course, there'll be a new government in the Western Cape as a sovereign state. So they will be in charge of the Navy, and I guess of the Western Cape Navy. So I guess you mean that to include Simonstown. Now, my immediate thought was, what Navy? So we'll have to create a budget to actually build a Navy again, because we don't have one at the moment. Any next questions? Yes, I can start to answer that, and then I'm going to hand over to Phil for his comments as well. Most secession movements would have been lucky to have these numbers. So these numbers are really positive. It shows very good support for Cape Independence, very robust support that has dropped a little bit since the previous poll, but not by a huge or margin that can't be overcome. So I definitely think, and listening to the Trump administration and their policies, that they will look positively on these numbers. There's no question in my mind. Phil, comments from your side?
Yeah, thanks, Joan. No, look, I think you're right. I think, look, effectively, what is the significance here? I think when we go to the US, we will be advocating that Cape Independence is not only in the best interests of the Western Cape people, which is obviously the key criteria, and that they must democratically want it in a referendum, but actually would also then align with the US's best interests, and I think that's self-evidently the case, given the challenges that we're currently having with the relations between South Africa and the US, where clearly there's this. We often talk about this fundamental ideological divide that exists in South Africa between this broadly Western population in the Western Cape and surrounds, and then this African nationalist population in the rest of South Africa. And it's that friction that we're seeing playing out. We've now got a US government that it has kind of abandoned polite diplomatic talk and is just shooting straight from the hip, and it's calling out the South African government for its appalling conduct and its antagonism towards the US and the West, and actually its own Western populations, which includes us in the Western Cape. So I think that so now suddenly this divide, which we've always referred to, is now a global political issue, and I think what we need to be able to demonstrate to the US is that Cape Independence is a viable proposition, and these numbers most certainly demonstrate that. Here we are, we're talking about taking these numbers whilst the GNU's been in place, whilst there is an element of hope and a slight slightly more positive sentiment in South Africa than has been the case. I think subsequent to these polls, we've obviously had the budget crisis, and the GNU is now in trouble, and I think that will put a very interesting spin on things as we move forward. We'll have to just then take it from there. But I think it's absolutely clear that were there to be a powerful referendum campaign, and after the GNU had collapsed, that there's a very, very high probability of the Western Cape voting for its independence, which is obviously the key criteria here.
The next question is, what is your thoughts that the support has dropped? Now, first of all, our polling results kind of implicated on why we think the support has dropped somewhat, and that is to do with the GNU and the promises made or the hopes created by the parties in the GNU, that this will sort of save South Africa. Now, we are nearly a year into the GNU, and frankly, some of the departments are reporting small administrative wins, but overall, there's no forward movement at all. The GNU at the moment, at best, hobbles along, but the hope is still there, as the polling results of a month or two showed at the moment. The GNU still operates now, but barely. It's technically not successful at all. So I would say that the reason why it's dropped is simply because of the GNU and the sentiments that people had and the promises that were made that South Africa would somehow be saved. And it has not happened, and it will not happen. The next question is, why has it dropped amongst Anglos? And I'm going to point that question to Phil, please.
Yeah, so I guess good question, and the question, look, so often what happens when you get polling results, let's go back a section and say, look, polling is the data. So one of the things, you hold a poll, you get the answer, and then you have to kind of look at that data and understand what you learn from there. So you don't know, you don't start with the position and produce the results. You have the results, and then you have to work there. So this is a question that we've looked ourselves, and at this point we can only speculate. We don't know, but there does seem to be a fairly clear trend in this data, and I think one of the significant factors, if you've been following Cape Independence, is the attitude of the English-speaking media compared to the attitude of the Afrikaans-speaking media, and certainly from our work in the CIAG, and perhaps even more so with the referendum party. Then in general, the Afrikaans-speaking media is willing to have a fair debate and show both sides of the story. To all intents and purposes, over the last 2 years, the English-speaking media has pulled a cordon sanitaire around Cape Independence. You almost get no articles now, where that wasn't the case in the past. And when you do, it's only really negative articles that are published. That clearly has an impact, and I think that's a space that the political parties, and particularly the DA, have been able to operate in. And no means am I somebody who is conspiratorial, and that's just the way things are. But it's very, very noticeable that in 2022 and 2023, Cape Independence was marginally higher, 1% amongst Afrikaners, but amongst English speakers than Afrikaners. And then suddenly we have this quite marked difference, and clearly, we can see what that is. It's white English-speaking DA voters. So I think it's a combination of the media doing what they're wanting to do. We know that in the current environment, the media is trying to sort of force its opinions as opposed to reporting the news objectively. That's a frustration, but it's just the reality, and we have to get on with that. There's no point complaining about it. And yeah, as Joan sort of eloquently pointed out, the DA are a very successful organisation marketing-wise, and they were able to sell the dream of the GNU. Well, in fact, ironically, let go back a section. They weren't able to sell the dream of the GNU. They're able to sell the dream of the MPC, which was never ever going to work, and we were on record saying it. So one of the remarkable things is the DA said we can get to 50% and we can remove the DA from power. It got everybody to vote for it on this promise of removing the ANC. It promptly then worked with the ANC and didn't remove it. Had never had any prospect of the MPC achieving, and now it's in the GNU and it's still saying, listen, we're in the GNU to create jobs and to create economic growth, but unemployment's at an all-time high, and economic growth is non-existent. And actually what we've seen in the GNU is loss after loss after loss. The budget passed without the DA support, the expropriation bill passed, and now this ability for nil compensation, the Bella bill, and particularly Afrikaans language being marginalized. So it's an interesting environment, but the bottom line is the DA are very, very successful at selling lies. I wish that wasn't the case, but they are, and it's our job to do that. But you can only get away with that for so long. So I think people shouldn't be unduly concerned. I think these are good numbers, and the fact that we know where the issues are helps us then to be able to address those issues moving forward too.
The next question is, will the DA support Cape Independence if the GNU fails? My immediate thought is possibly, but probably no initially. So they will need to see some kind of leverage from the Cape Independence side, some solid support, maybe some pressure from international partners. And some pressure from inside. As we've seen, more than half of, I can't remember the exact number now, but quite a majority of DA supporters actually support Cape Independence as well. So they will face pressure from inside their voters, and then from inside their party leadership as well. So eventually, I can see that they may. A private referendum, a good, successful private referendum will just increase that pressure too. The next question is, the Cape Independence movement has been alive for nearly 2 decades. Why is this taking so long, and what is the holdup? Phil, please.
Look, unfortunately, secession takes time. It's a radical solution. If we look around the world, this is not an uncommon amount of time. And whilst the Cape Independence movement has been around, I think since 2007, really only started to get traction about 2020. So we're about 4 or 5 years into the period of real traction for Cape Independence. And we've got to remember that secession is a radical solution. People will naturally gravitate towards compromise solutions, which is what we're seeing in the Western Cape. And we saw in this polling data how strongly the Western Cape favours autonomy, favours forms of autonomy. But actually, you've got the government saying, or the provincial government saying, we don't need our independence. We can just get more autonomy. In theory, we could have federalism. The Western Cape government actually blocked federalism, so that's a bit of a misnomer. But I mean, they are trying unsuccessfully for the main part to get devolution. So you just have to understand that these things take time, and often they just require critical, almost black swan events, significant moments in time that you then have to grasp. And we're in one now. At this point in time, there are 2 things on the table. the collapse of the GEO and this final proof that there is no way of the Western Cape people being governed according with a democratic will. And if the DA the DA aren't going to get elected to the national government, they've proved they can't deliver an MPC, and it looks like very shortly they're going to show that they cannot deliver on any of their goals in a government of national unity. So that's kind of a very significant point. It sort of comes to the end of the line for all of those stories, because at that point anybody can see that this isn't going to work. And then the arrival of the world's most dominant political power, turning its crosshairs firmly on South Africa and calling it out for conduct that it's got away with for years without being called on, is really, really significant. And we mustn't understate the opportunity this presents. And I know people may be divided on their views on the American administration, but from a Cape Independence point of view, this is Christmas for us. It's an opportunity that is beyond our wildest dreams, and we absolutely have to grasp that, and that's absolutely why we are grasping that. And we expect the trip to the US to be a very, very significant moment in Cape Independence. But it takes time. There's no easy way. It would be absolutely lovely if we just put one advert in the paper and everybody came running. It just doesn't work that way, unfortunately. But it would be. But anyway, we just got to be patient, not give up, and just fight for every yard. And eventually, when we get it, then you'll look back and it would have been inevitable all along.
Thank you, Phil. The next question: why do colored support independence more than whites? And I just want to add something here in terms of an answer. We must remember that colored people, the colored communities, are at the coalface. They've been struggling or suffering under apartheid, and now they're struggling under BEE as well. So I would say, because they're at the coalface and taking the brunt maybe of all the policies that are race-based, that's where their support comes from. Now, if we can, I think I saw a question as well of how we can grow support. Now, awareness of Cape Independence is still an area where we can most definitely grow. So the awareness is about, I don't know, between 50 and 60%. So if we can increase that to 80%, 90%, or even more, and that will come as part of a campaign for a private referendum, then we can most certainly increase the support as well. Next question. With people that fear that if they don't vote for the DA, that the ANC will gain a stronghold in the Western Cape, what can we advise them? Well, that was one of the very successful marketing ploys, if I can put it like that, of the DA as part of the multi-party charter, that they warn people if they don't vote DA, or if they vote for any smaller party and waste their vote, that the ANC will somehow come into power. But actually the ANC's margin or votes in the Western Cape is far from the majority, far from taking power. So it's just creating awareness among people that is not, it's fear-mongering, to say the least. I don't know if you want to add something, Phil.
No, look, the ANC are dead in the Western Cape. That's not particularly the issue. No. I think actually, funnily enough, the biggest fear in the Western Cape should not be the ANC. It should be the radical black parties, the EFF. We saw MK win their first election. I think the ANC are dead and buried in the Western Cape, but that's not the fear. look, we all understand that the demographics of the Western Cape are changing significantly. They're changing as a result of government policy, and that is allowing vast scale illegal land invasions, and then advantaging people through race-based policy. So we've got an artificial, so for us as an organisation that's profoundly non-racial, that to us is really problematic. We believe in the rule of law, we believe in non-racialism, and we believe in a fair crack for everybody. We don't believe in a society that's stacked in the favour of people who are illegally migrating to the Western Cape and then been advantaged over the people that were there in the first place. But one of the priorities of that, one of the realities of that, is that the DA probably has got 10 years left in government in the Western Cape. One of the interesting statistics is in 2024 that the first time that the majority of coloured voters and the majority of black voters voted against the DA, or almost no black voters in the Western Cape voted for the DA. And ironically, it was white voters that kept the DA in power, because there'd been a massive amount of migration, legal migration, from particularly Gauteng to the Western Cape. So we saw a situation where in the last decade, 300,000 white people had moved into the Western Cape, and the DA ended up with a majority of 154,000. So it's living on borrowed time. So ironically, I think that's an important thing, that people kind of almost looking at the wrong thing. They kind of think it's the DA and the ANC, but that's not the issue here. The issue is that the Western Cape just resembles the rest of South Africa very quickly. We no longer have a DA government with its warts and all. We know at least it governs better than the rest. And in a decade, we just have a provincial government like all of the others, and then the opportunity is gone. And that's the real danger. There isn't a magic wand to convince people. If the truth was the magic solution, then the referendum party would have won the elections at a canter. If you look back and say, well, what do we say? MPC is dead in the water. It's never going to happen. You've got to decide whether you want to have a first world future under a broadly Western government pursuing sensible policy in the Western Cape. And if you don't vote for Cape Independence, you're going to end up with the DA, and it's going to be business as usual, and you're still going to have the ANC in charge of the black nationalist parties. That's exactly what happened in the day. So unfortunately, sometimes the truth isn't enough, but all you can do is just keep pushing that and trust the sentiment.
Okay, next question. Does the Freedom Front Plus still support Cape Independence? If so, why are they still in the GNU and not talking about it more? So obviously, we can't talk for the Freedom Front Plus and the new leader, Corné Mulder. But he has said, I think it was about 10 days ago, he has pertinently said that they support Cape Independence and they support various other forms of self-determination elsewhere. So he is now the national leader of the Freedom Front. So they've got to look after the whole country. But as I said, they do support Cape Independence, as do they support other forms of self-determination elsewhere in the country. They are still in the GNU, and again, I can't speak for them, so I can only speculate that they think they can still make a difference in the GNU and in the department that they're heading. So yes, that's where we are, and we'll have to see what will happen. At the moment, Ramaphosa and the DA are playing a little bit of chicken. Nobody wants to be the one to either leave first or kick the other one out. But it's honestly, I can't see how they can still save the situation. And why I'm saying this is it would be my guess, but only a guess, that the Freedom Front will then also leave the GNU. Why haven't Cape Independence parties unified? Simply because they may both stand for Cape Independence as the main issue, and I'm talking referendum party now, the Freedom Front and the Cape Independence Party as political parties. We must remember that a political party has a broader base, a broader manifesto that they stand on, and there are differences between these parties where they may all support Cape Independence. They've got slightly different ideologies and ideas how, for instance, a government should work, different audiences and different target markets amongst voters. We are working closely together, however, and we will see, in my mind, we will see some cooperation in the 2026 and 2029 elections. Aside from gaining independence from the rest of South Africa, what core policies would a Cape Independence Party prioritize as its first course of action? Now, from my mind, it's most definitely to boost the economy, and that includes the end of all race-based policies and to make the business environment as easy as humanly possible to do business in the Western Cape and with the Western Cape, and that includes overseas investments as well. Phil, you want to add anything?
No, I don't think. Look, I, just to reiterate, I think the key thing is, look, after independence, and it's interesting enough, it's something we're doing work on at the moment, but getting Cape Independence isn't the end of the line. Then you have to create a country, and one of the things is Cape Independence is a divisive, as we've seen through the polling, is a divisive issue. And if we win a referendum, broadly half of the population is going to have voted against it. And the very, very first thing we have to do is radically improve people's lives and prove to even the people that voted against Cape Independence that it absolutely is in their best interests, and people need to see it in their best interest very, very, very quickly. So it's going to be essential that we hit the ground running, and that we start, dealing with unemployment, dealing with poverty, dealing with services, and particularly dealing with people who've been marginalised in society. I'm probably that's really important that we and you talked about jobs and the economy, and that obviously is absolutely the key to improving people's lives.
So the next question is, which Cape Independence parties and organization are 100% on board with the referendum and democratic process recognized in international law thereafter for Western Cape independence? So I've mentioned the three political parties, and then of course we have the CIAG, and we have the Cape Exit non-profit. And I just want to reiterate that we are working closely together with all of those organizations and institutions.
Joan, can I just jump in there, because I think I'm understanding the question here a bit different to how you're.
Okay.
I think the question here is, and actually there is always this slightly irritating thing, and I see it's, and I'm not meaning to think, but I'm going to pick up on it, this notion, constant reference to the ULA and the UCS, and I see it, and I think that's probably what Rochelle is somehow suggesting, that there's this international process, and why don't we just get involved? And Rochelle effectively is asking, are we following international law? We absolutely are. For those that have followed my work, I am somebody who is extremely knowledgeable around the international law and the rights of self-determination. I speak on it regularly. And any notion that somehow Western Cape independence, the Cape independence movement, is not aligned with international law, it is absolutely nonsensical. And it's not just international law. It's really important that the secession movement has to be aligned with the South African Constitution and international law in conjunction. And I'm not disparaging anybody else's efforts. They're welcome to do that. But this notion that somehow Cape independence is 90% done, and all you have to do is just say the magic word is ludicrous and simply simply not true. The bottom line is there is the key process to Cape independence. The very, very first thing, whatever we're doing, is holding a referendum and establishing the democratic will of the Western Cape people. That is the basis. So we have self-determination. Now, we also agree in our plan that the ultimate size of the Cape would very likely be bigger than the Western Cape, but you have to start somewhere. And the Montevideo Convention of 1933 makes it very, very clear what are the requirements of statehood: a permanent population, a defined territory, a political authority, and the ability to enter into foreign relations with other states. They are the 4 criteria of statehood. And if you can't comply with those 4 criteria of statehood, then you're not going to get independence. So the logical place to start is the Western Cape, which has got a permanent population. We know it. It's got a defined territory. We know it. It's got a border. It's got a political authority. It's got a provincial government. And ironically, it shouldn't have entered yet into foreign relations, but it's already entered into foreign relations when the Western Cape government banned Russian diplomats at the start of the Ukraine crisis and invited the Ukrainian diplomats in for negotiations. So the Western Cape ticks all of those boxes. It allows us then to have a really good basis to assert that, and then into the South African Constitution. Now, the South African Constitution, and I see somebody's put it in the comment, Section 235. Well, you've got to go. Section 235 doesn't allow for secession. Section 235 allows for self-determination, and secession is one form of self-determination. So we mustn't be careful to get, a dog has got 4 legs, everything with 4 legs is a dog. That isn't the case. 235 is an important part of the Constitution. Actually, 232 is more important, because 232 establishes that any international covenants which have been signed and ratified by South Africa are law in the Republic. And Section 235 has a formulation that causes some dispute, where South Africa has ratified and signed 3 international agreements since 1994, and Section 232 makes those laws in the Republic. So, but the law around secession is complex, and we have to understand that secession is the last act, in a process. So look, let's all work together. I absolutely agree. One of the things that we've always done, I've always done, is push really heavily to cooperate for the groups, and eventually we work together all the time. So let's be clear. But actually, for closer cooperation, it's not always possible. I get as frustrated as other people too when that isn't the case. Currently, there's a good level of cooperation going on behind the scenes, which is great, and we're all cooperating in terms of going to the US. So the CIAG is sending a delegation to the US, but it's doing that in conjunction with Cape Exit and the Cape Independence Party. So that's really, really positive. It's great that there are other organizations out there. So we've got absolutely nothing against the ULA or the UCS fighting for self-determination for minorities outside of the Western Cape. That's great. But yeah, this notion that somehow you can that all the work's been done and simply we almost just jump on board with the process is not the case. I can absolutely tell you that the Cape Independence movement is far in advance of anything that the ULA or the UCS has currently achieved, that's just the reality of where we are. So I'm just going to put that straight so that we've got it on record somewhere.
Right, thank you, Phil. Next question from Beverly. Considering the potential influx of thousands of families upon the realization of Cape independence, are you prepared? It should be assessed in light of US refugee polls indicating significant migratory interest. So yes, that's the idea of having a sovereign country. You've got proper immigration and border control policies in place that are effectively and efficiently enforced. So that is where you have a controlled, if I can put it like that, controlled immigration. So you actually get the people inside your country that can that can offer valuable skills for interest that's the idea. So there'll be most certainly be a kind of a hard border and immigration policies, and then as well a discouragement of illegal immigration for those who manage to come across the border in an illegal fashion. Next question. What's the projected timeline of a potential private referendum looking like, considering the significant, albeit manageable, drop in outright support? So the timeline for a potential private referendum, given that the funding is in place, and a private referendum will cost a significant amount of money. But given that that funding is in place, we could probably do a private referendum within 6 to 12 months. So let's aim for, let's say, 12 months. So that will give you time to do all the technical preparations and all the planning, which we are already busy doing. And more importantly, though, a campaign, a pro-independence campaign attached to the private referendum as well. So that gives you a rough idea, given that the funding, sufficient funding is in place. Next question. I think I saw some questions about the viability of the Western Cape as a sovereign or independent state, and I can maybe quickly talk about that, including the sources of income. So the Western Cape and its geographical size and its economical size is about the same as a mid-EU country. So that gives you an idea of the viability in terms of size and size of the economy. Now, there was a question about the sources of income as well. Any country, the absolute majority source of income is taxes of some form of another or another. And I'm excluding debt here. So at the moment, the Western Cape people pays about 300 billion rand in taxes. That goes to the national government. We get about 25% of that back in terms of a provincial allocation that the Western Cape government then has direct control over and employs and distributes, allocates in terms of priorities in its own budget. The rest is then either spent by the national government in the Western Cape in terms of national functions like police, health, education, whatever the case may be. And about 15%, according to my most recent calculations, are then distributed to resource other provinces, the more poorer provinces. So we do have enough money, enough income as it is to run the Western Cape as an effective sovereign state. If we can, on top of that, on top of the 15% that we can then utilize for ourselves as well, that goes elsewhere at the moment, and the 60% of national functions that are run by national departments in the Western Cape, if we can improve the efficiency by, let's say, just 10 or 15%, you can imagine where we can be in terms of additional revenue to spend on other things, or then to reduce taxes. So that's my basic answer on those questions. The next question is, given that many people in the Western Cape, such as ANC supporters, oppose Cape independence, is there a realistic risk of civil unrest or even civil conflict if the movement gains traction? There is always a risk of civil unrest and conflict. I don't see any kind of civil war. I don't see the parent country, then in this case being South Africa, starting a military conflict against the Western Cape, because it will be a lose-lose situation. Instead, any reasonable person or party, and I do think there are reasonable people in the ANC as well, can see that a win-win situation will benefit all of us. Now, in terms of civil unrest inside of the Western Cape, I think it will be localized, as we've seen in the taxi unrest. And I think the current government is very well suited, very well skilled, experienced and resourced to deal with that effectively. Next question. How would the newly seceded Cape defend its borders from the maniacs wanting to destroy its sovereignty? Now, defending borders are not, it's not rocket science. and it doesn't have to cost a lot of money either. If we talk about a hard border, we've got farms that have got fences, for instance. They've got borders that would be on the provincial border in any case. So you would train those farmers. You will possibly bring back, and I'm talking from what I would do personally. So obviously the new government will decide on those policies, but you'll use technology, drones, for instance, certain monitoring systems. You'll most possibly bring the commandos back, and you'll have it can be a modest size border patrol force. So you'll have a combination of all of those to defend and protect the borders. And then, of course, Western Cape would have, and I saw a question about this as well, would have military, which would hopefully have all the three wings, an army, a navy, and an air force as well, that can help with this protection. Would it not be better to do the private referendum closer to the elections? Phil, I'm going to ask you to answer that one, please.
Sorry, I muted myself by accident. Look, I think we're just going to have to wait for the optimal moment. So what's going to happen in terms of that referendum? Clearly, the funding is going to have to be in place, and the political environment is going to have to be suitable. So we, at this point in time, we're making the technical preparations behind the scenes. We're starting on the fundraising. And obviously, then we'll have to wait for the right opportunity. Probably, ironically, I would suggest that keeping it away from the referendum, from the elections, would be better. In so much as the trouble around the elections is then you run back into this very same issue we had in 2024, which is the DA's propaganda machine rolling out and convincing people once again that they have some magic solution, as opposed to Cape Independence, and that's the big danger. The ideal time to host a private referendum is when it's very, very clear that there aren't any other alternatives. So I mean, the dream scenario would be shortly after the collapse of the GNU, but I don't think we'll be ready for that. But who knows? So yeah, anyway, it's the answer is I don't think so. But we have to be ready, and we're doing the best that we can with that. It's a big undertaking, and we're a small operation.
Next question. Once Cape Independence is established, how will you move non-qualifying residents out of the Western Cape? How will you deal with people who own property in the Western Cape but then do not qualify as a resident? Phil, do you mind?
Sure, no, I don't. Look, I'm always slightly wary of this, because it's a very provocative question, and the danger is that people read into answers the wrong thing. So first of all, we're fighting, when we have Cape Independence, the people who are legally here are entitled to take up residency, and that is right. And that will be the first port of call. We'll be saying, right, then let's just formalise who's citizens of the Western Cape, who's not citizens of the Western Cape, and then obviously there'll be the notion for people who may wish to be resident but not be citizens, and those are going to be a number of things that we're going to have to negotiate in the negotiations around Cape Independence, which will be a negotiation effectively by the Western Cape government and the national government in the first instance, but obviously, clearly key players like ourselves will have some input into that process. What we have to find is a process that's fair, non-racial, is going to be accepted by the international community, and is in line with international norms. And the short answer is, if you look at the G20 countries, they all have virtually identical immigration policies. And that, I guess, is the basis of what is fair, and our policies would be aligned with those. Now, they may change between a year here or a year there. Sometimes you live in the country for 4 years to naturalise. Sometimes it's 6, sometimes it's 10, sometimes it's 2. But ultimately, the same process. You can acquire citizenship by residence, by descent, normally through establishing a business and so on. But you have to do it legally, and obviously that is the key process. But we must remember that once we've established this country, we want skilled immigration. Countries don't not want immigration. You want immigration, but what you want people who are coming into your economy, who are going to contribute to it and are going to help grow it, to raise the standard of living for everybody. So the reality is, people who are wanting to come to the Western Cape and create a better life for themselves because they're going to create a business, or they're going to create employment or invest in the economy, are going to be very, very welcome.
Next question. Are there discussions in the pipeline between the USA and Western Cape for growth? And I guess you mean economic growth, and that will most certainly form part of our discussions with the Trump administration and its representatives in the upcoming talks. So yes.
Looks
like, I think that may be the last question.
Yes.
So yes.
It does look
Leela.
like it's the last question. Sorry, Joan, I'm talking on top of you. Yes, and we've actually at an hour now. So this ends the press conference. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. See you soon.
Thank you.